Howdy y'all, welcome back to the Black Sheep Meadow. Today we're going to talk about compost and the composting process. This will probably be at least a two-part video, if not a three-part video, just due to the broad information spectrum on this subject. Let's talk about compost and the organic or aerobic composting process. Compost is simply an organic material that has been broken down into a nutrient-rich soil. Some of the ingredients that we start with in a composting process are going to be, some people will tell you greens and browns. I find that's a little vague. I like to say just let's go ahead and put it to our browns are carbon material and our greens are nitrogen material. Some examples of our carbon material is going to be wood chips, some smaller tree bark twigs, chainsaw shavings, that type material. We could even get into some sawdust from a local sawmill. Some of the sawdust, though, I'd be very careful with just to make sure it doesn't have any glue or treated lumber in it. Some people will tell you even cardboard material. I try not to do cardboard material simply because there can be too many things in the cardboard that was used as a binder that you just don't want in your compost pile. These are all examples of carbon material. Our nitrogen materials can actually be green grass clippings, garden waste, and kitchen scraps. We're going to use all these to make a compost pile. Start a compost pile here in just a minute. One of the reasons I don't like saying greens and browns is because one of the biggest nitrogen-rich materials that I'll use in my compost pile is coffee grounds. And we can see the coffee grounds is a nitrogen-rich material, but there is nothing green about it. That is a brown. So I don't like to use the word green and browns. The words green and browns just simply because there's so much confusion with nitrogen to carbon mix up there. All right, so for demonstration purposes, we're going to start a new compost pile here on the ground today. I get that most people don't have the room to be able to make a compost pile on the ground. You can do the tumble bins and etc. and so on. There's several reasons why I don't use those. One being that first off, the microorganisms that we're going to need to start this compost pile and the organisms that are going to need to be breaking down all this organic matter are going to come from the ground. This compost pile, currently the one that's existing here, has been here for about a month, and I can guarantee you if we were to dig up underneath it, we're going to find some earthworms that have already made their way to those nutrients. But for demonstration purposes, we're going to start a new pile here on the ground. Ultimately, we're going to rotate this one over into it. This one needs to be turned. It needs oxygen in the pile again. Let's take a look over here at this. So our four things that we need for a compost pile to work is a ratio of 30-to-1 approximately of carbon to nitrogen material. We need 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. The other two things that the microorganisms that are going to be eating on this pile need is going to be water and oxygen. You can see on this pile here, I got a thermal gauge in it where I can actually measure the center of the pile. You can see this gauge, we're probably about 102 degrees outside right now, and this gauge is falling back to that 100 and 105 degree mark. About 2 weeks ago, maybe 2.5 weeks ago, this pile, when it had the correct moisture and oxygen content in the middle, this pile was upwards of 140 degrees. So the fact that this temperature has fallen from 140 down to 105 is telling us that the microorganisms that are in the middle of the pile are starting to die off because they're missing water, they're missing oxygen, or one of the four elements that we need for this compost pile to work. We already know we got plenty of nitrogen. I've mixed this as well as our carbon material. It's mixed very thoroughly inside this pile. So we know that we need to get oxygen back to them and water in this case. So as soon as we start our new pile, and these piles, I'll build on them all year long. This pile obviously was started, we're in the first part of August, so this pile was probably started the first part of July, later part of June. I'll build on this pile all the way through the winter. I'm going to show you some other piles here in a minute that were started back in March of 2022, and then I've got another pile that was started that would have probably been in the spring of 2020. So these piles take a considerably long time to get going and to complete. So let's start on our new pile. Okay, so we're going to start on the first layer of our pile, and we have a bag full of sawdust shavings from a local sawmill. Once again, I need to stress that no treated lumber or no heavy glue in the wood that they're making the sawdust out of. So let's start with our first layer. Okay. Let's kind of even this out. We got a good carbon layer. Spread it out. Now, here's something else to say too. Another reason I like to do them on the ground is your compost material, in order for it to work correctly, it needs to be abundant in size. I've heard 3 foot by 3 foot over and over again. That's fine. Compost could be made in an 80 by 80 pile if you wanted to. Obviously, the smaller it gets, the less heat it's going to hold. The less heat it holds, the slower it's going to break down, the longer it's going to take. Most of our piles are probably going to consist of 6 by 6 or 8 by 8. But nonetheless, this is a good size for me to work with the tractor. All right, so before we lay our first layer of nitrogen material on top of our carbon material, I'd like to point out that the shavings in the pile that I started over a month ago, you can see the color of the shaving, how it's beginning to break down. This pile looked exactly like this when we started. Get our first layer of nitrogen. Okay, so in between these layers of carbon and nitrogen, we're going to add water. Because we're so remote, we keep our compost piles far away from the actual homestead out here in the pasture. I have to bring the water to us. So let me fire this up and I'm going to get this irrigated down. All right, so we missed a little clip there on the second layer of carbon and second layer of nitrogen material, but it's still the same. We have garden scrap, some kitchen scrap, our coffee grounds, and of course for our second layer of carbon material, we've got more sawdust. We're going to put a little bit more water on this. I want to get the moisture to the correct consistency, and then we're going to start piling our pile that I started a month ago on top of this one. All right, so we got our moisture content in our pile about exactly how we want it. We can almost, probably just getting a little bit too much water out of it. We're perfectly fine right here. We're gonna add our existing compost pile on top of here. Actually, I'm gonna go for a shovel. All right, so we got our original compost pile moved on top of the pile that we just started for demonstration purposes for y'all. You can see the color of the material out of our original pile is substantially darker than what we started with. That's exactly what we're looking for. There was plenty of little microorganisms, little bugs and whatnot inside that pile working on it. I've actually also irrigated it once again. We got the consistency of the pile. I don't know if you guys can see that. Let me pull up close. We got the consistency of the pile where you could just barely squeeze any moisture out of it. So now I'm going to install a thermostat, and this thermostat's probably about 18-20 inches long, and I want to get that thermostat to the middle of that pile so we can monitor the activity of the pile in the upcoming weeks or so. So let's go on to an existing pile that we've had that I flipped last week. Okay, so we're here at currently my largest compost pile here at the homestead, and this pile's been going since early part of March. Once again, I've added on to this compost pile, so from I guess the early part of March, April, May, June, so about 4 or 5 months I added on to this pile. I just flipped it last weekend. This is August 7th, so I flipped it right around the 1st. I want to show you that this pile, it had actually started to degrade in temperature. This pile's consistently produced temperatures of 150 to 152 degrees. Once you start reaching those temperatures, the pile just will not continue to rise in temperature because the heat is actually killing off your microorganisms that are eating on the pile. But once they peak, they'll hang around the 140 degree mark for at least 10 days. And especially on a pile this size, they have a lot of nutrients, a lot of moisture, a lot of oxygen in this pile to continue growing on. As you can see, we flipped it last week. When you flip a pile, just as we showed you right before, we're going to almost bring it to ambient temperature. So whatever the water temperature is, whatever the outside air temp is, that pile is going to meet that. Over the next 10 to 15 days, the microorganisms, as they're working, they're eating up all your food inside your pile, using up the oxygen, they're generating the heat. And that's what we're seeing here. This is how we monitor our organisms and how active they are. Get it close. I also want to take a note. I want to try and dig down in here. I don't know how well the camera is going to see it. But this pile, look at our moisture that we still have in this pile. It's super hot in there. That's good. That's exactly what we want. We still have a lot of moisture in this pile, though. That's what we want to see. Okay, this is a completed compost pile that we've actually been digging off of and adding to our garden for most of this year so far. But I want to show you this compost. It's actually, I'm going to get it real close here. You can see how all the organic matter is broken down. You almost, you can't distinguish what was grass or sticks or vegetables anymore. It's got some sand in it from where we use the tractor to move it around, maybe a little bit of fresh grass that's grown up around the pile. But this is our ultimate end goal. This is what we want. This is a very nutrient-rich soil. I actually have a soil test that I sent off for analysis of actually what's in our compost. So I'm actually going to put a link to that, so you can actually see that at the end of the video. All right, guys, I want to thank y'all for joining me on my composting video today. If y'all get a chance, go ahead and hit that like and even subscribe buttons. I wanted to give y'all a sneak peek at what's coming up. We understand that not everybody has access to the raw land and materials to make their own compost piles. So we wanted to show you in the future, we're going to do a little sneak peek. We're going to do a video on different types of compost or garden mixes that can be store-bought. We're actually going to do a little trial and run error as to see which one produces the best vegetables. So stay tuned. You know that's going to be in the future. We'll see y'all later.